I want to welcome everybody here in attendance and those of you who are watching online. This event is co-sponsored by the Boutel Day Poetry Center. Its subject, as you know, is Emily Dickinson, who is one of the greatest American poets. And she's having a bit of a resurgence, thanks to these two people here today. So why don't I introduce them? The first, Alena Smith. She is a playwright and TV writer who is well known as the creator, showrunner, and executive producer of the critically acclaimed series Dickinson. The show, which stars Haley Steinfeld as Emily Dickinson, recently aired its third and final season. Dickinson won a Peabody Award and was nominated for a GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. Smith made her directorial debut with the show's final episode, which must have been fun. Her plays include Icebergs, which had its world premiere in 2016 at the Geffen Playhouse, The Bad Guys, Plucker, The Lacey Project, and The New Sincerity, which the New York Times called splendid, entertaining, and thought-provoking, a comedy with a poignant edge. You've been busy. Jericho Brown is a poet whose first book, entitled Please, won the American Book Award. His most recent book is The Tradition, which was a finalist for the 2019 National Book Award and the winner of the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Thank you so much for joining us. Please welcome them. Alena's TV series is the subject of a podcast, The Slave Is Gone, hosted by Jericho and fellow poet Brianne Janae, that talks back to the Apple TV series Dickinson. I told them I would start with an icebreaker question. What's your favorite Dickinson poem and why?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Hi, Jericho. It's excited to be here together talking, not, IRL, not online.
You should tell them you're meeting for the first time.
Yes, we just met for the first time. And obviously, I cannot pick a favorite Dickinson poem because what's so magical about Emily's work is that there seems to be almost an infinite number of just poems that grab you and twist your mind around and bring all kinds of amazing imagery, to life that you would never have thought of these words going together before. But I guess the poem that comes to my mind when I'm asked this question is a poem that we use in the finale of season 2 of Dickinson, which is "You Cannot Put a Fire Out." It says, "You cannot put a fire out, a thing that can ignite, can go itself without a fan upon the slowest night," or something. And then it says, "You cannot fold a flood and put it in the drawer." And I don't remember the second part. But I love that because that is sort of how I felt while I was making the show Dickinson, which took me, 4 years of development before I even sold it, and then 2 years of making season 1 before it aired, and it was such a difficult process but I kept saying, "You cannot put a fire out," and I couldn't put my fire out for making the show. And it is really amazing to be sitting here in 2022 on the other side of 3 seasons of the show, here in Dickinson's homeland, in Plath's alma mater, where we had an episode where Emily time travels to the future and meets Sylvia as a student of Smith, and to be here with Jericho, who is a poet of our moment, and it just feels really meaningful in terms of all the intentions of what the show was for. So I'm really, really glad to be here.
I just happen to have a poem with me. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door to her divine majority, present no more. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor be kneeling upon her mat. I've known her from an ample nation. Choose one, then close the valves of her attention like stone. It's pretty good. It's so good. It's really good. Yeah. So I really love that poem. to be quite honest with you, because it is so angsty. You know, there's something about, one of the things that I love about Dickinson's work is that the poems are from the self to the self. They are always poems to the mind, you know, which I'm amazed by, which is why she has all of these very odd, surreal moments, folding a flood and putting it in a drawer, you know, these moments in the poem, because she's really talking to herself. There's in this poem this sense of desire, of want, and therefore a sense of eros, you know, and I love that about her work, that it's always, in spite of how people like to think of her as this recluse, she's always in these poems reaching for someone else, you know. I love that.
Well, I love your description of the poem, so thank you. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what inspired you to do the series in the first place. And Jericho, maybe you could talk about when you decided to do a podcast. And feel free to talk to each other, too.
Sure. Well, it's a perfect jumping off from what you just said, because I think that one of the things that made me want to make this show is that I had a conversation with a Dickinson scholar who was somebody that I knew growing up. And we talked about how Emily's life was fundamentally unrequited. You know, she wrote nearly 2,000 poems, almost none of which were published while she lived. None were published with her name attached. You know, she was in love with her, or at least, you know, arguably in love with her best friend who married her brother and moved into the house next door. She, you know, lived a life of constant longing, constant desire to be seen for the greatness that she was, and I think almost never getting that, if ever. And so that to me seemed like a very funny setup for a TV show. But it does explain why I chose to make the show a half-hour comedy instead of an hour-long drama, you know, which you might have assumed that the right format for a period piece about a famous poet would be a long sort of masterpiece theater-esque drama, but I felt that Emily's life sort of had the structure of a classic sitcom, which is that, you know, no matter what happened to her during the day, she just ended up back at her desk in her room writing a poem. So yeah, those were some of the things. And I guess also just related to something else you said about, you know, her mind and her speaking to herself in her poems. This is a person whose life, whose external life couldn't have been more mundane, but whose internal life is so vast and so magnificent. And that also, to me, seemed like this deep irony. Emily's life is just defined by ironies and paradoxes, and that's, again, why I thought that it was the right mode for a half-hour show. So, yeah.
Did you always know she would be a teenager?
Well, okay, she's not a teenager. Myth busting. In the first season, she is meant to be probably like 20, 21, 22, something like that. So, but it's funny because I believe that she's easily seen as a teenager because she still lives with her parents. But of course, and in the first season, you know, her whole arc is about standing up to her dad, basically, and claiming herself as a poet against her father's wishes. And that does seem like a teenage coming-of-age story. But, you know, I also think it's interesting to reflect on how long many young people do live with their parents that go way beyond teenagerhood. So, but yes, it is, I mean, you know, in truth, Emily, you know, the series climaxes in the years of the Civil War when she had her greatest outpouring as an artist. In truth, she was 30 then. I don't think we ever quite got our wonderful star Haley Steinfeld, you know, to be 30 because she was 25, I think, when we shot the last season. But, you know, for me, it's Emily's early 20s.
Yeah. There's an episode where she's getting all her friends to play Othello. And that episode reminds me of when I was in high school playing Othello, you know. So I started.
And it was based on reality. I mean, she did have a Shakespeare club.
Oh, wow.
And there was I just read, there was a book called Emily Dickinson's Shakespeare. I'm sorry, I don't remember who wrote it right now, but it's a great work of scholarship about Shakespeare and how it was in Dickinson's world. And yes, they had a Shakespeare club, and yes, there was trouble about whether women were allowed to be part of it or not. And then there was also this just like unbelievable discourse of the time of white people not believing that that Shakespeare had intended Othello to be black. They couldn't believe it. They said he must have meant Italian, or so it's just I don't know. But this was my favorite thing about this show, was going and finding these bizarre artifacts and antiques, and then repurposing them and recontextualizing them to reveal something about today.
I think I started doing the podcast. I did two things. I wanted to do things that I thought of as rigorous, but I wanted to do that which I would not expect myself to do because I had won a Pulitzer Prize. So I very consciously, one thing I did was I took an acting class where I teach at Emory University. And now I just take an acting class every semester that they let me in. And sometimes, they act like they're not going to let me in. And I'm like, what's up? And then the other thing that I did when I was approached by the producers of our podcast is I said yes to doing this thing because it was a different way to talk about and to spread the magic of poetry. Yeah, and I thought, oh, wow. And one of the things I love about the show is that we get to see these words literally come up on the screen as Emily Dickinson is writing them. And so whether you like it or not, if you watch the show, that means that day you read a poem. And I really wanted to be a part of that. And I wanted to be a part of bringing this great poet back again in a new way. If we think about, you've been here 10 years. Smith is not the Smith that it was 10 years ago. The students, my interaction, I've been where I teach for 10 years now. My interaction with my students are completely different. It's like, wait, what happened to 18-year-olds? Like, what are y'all doing now?
Wait, can you say more about that? I want to know more.
Well, I mean, the concerns, my students, first of all, they're the most, and this actually has grown. They're the most moral and ethical people I've ever met. Emory University is the only, I used to think it was, maybe it's this way at Smith. If you walk by the trash cans, y'all see those trash cans? Those trash cans are designated for different things. If one of my students sees me put the wrong thing in the wrong trash can, they are going to stop me and tell me, oh, Dr. Brown, paper goes in this trash can. That trash can is for aluminum. And they mean that. Do you know what I mean? And my students, and that has grown in the last, they were that way when I got to Emory, and now they're just like revolutionary freedom fighters. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. I'm at Smith College. I do. We can talk more about that. I do.
So, yeah, and I like the idea that this medium and the podcast, television podcast, that there are many ways for us to spread Dickinson and to spread poetry in general, and to make young people understand that though the poetry might be old, it is still theirs. It's for them.
So it's a comedy, right? But the New Yorker said that the program at first seemed like a riff on a beloved poet, but now looks like a radical reading of the poems themselves. I'm just wondering what you both think about that. Yes, it's a comedy, but it's quite profound.
Well, I mean, the labels of comedy and drama and whatever else, they don't really work for a lot of shows that are on TV today, and they definitely don't really work for Dickinson. But it's funny, now the show's over and we will never win an Emmy, so now I can say that it's not really a comedy, because I wasn't allowed to say that before because we were entered in the comedy track for Emmys. So anyway,
But Ted Lasso won some Emmys. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Okay, so no, I mean Dickinson.
Shade.
Dickinson is a crazy show. I mean, I don't think that it fits in any genre, and I think that we have elements of horror. We have elements of farce. We have elements. They're like I think, and the again the sort of like hyper abundance of modes and tones is really coming from Emily and from the poems. And one thing I always stress is like Emily is very funny. She has poems that are just deeply hilarious. But she also has many poems that are of the utmost seriousness. And so anyway, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because to talk about sort of perhaps, a generation that is open to the idea of radicalism or revolution, it's not that Emily Dickinson, the real person, was a radical or a revolutionary, because she wasn't. There's absolutely no evidence of that. It's that the spirit of her poetry is so deeply radical, and that she, a person who certainly grew up like in the midst of all of literature. She knew writers, she read books, she had access. She knew what the rules were for poetry, and she didn't follow them. She broke them. She broke the rules of punctuation. She broke the rules of spelling. She broke the rules of publication. She broke the rules of celebrity. She broke, she broke every rule, and she didn't do it by accident. She did it for some reason, some mysterious purpose, and she did it steadily for decades, her whole life. Another thing, people always think people hear female poet and they assume she killed herself at a young age. No, she died at an old age of natural causes. And, she lived her whole life just writing these poems, just writing these radical poems. And so that spirit is the spirit that I took up in the show to create my character of Emily, who is more radical than who the real Emily would have been.
I'll just say to the question that a lot of this work has already been done, but there is a way that the show provides for college professors and for academicians, for anyone interested in research and scholarship in that way. Suddenly you're in a position where you cannot try to read an Emily Dickinson poem without also thinking about the queer reading of the poem. And I think that's something that many Emily Dickinson scholars want to run away from, want to fight about. But it ends up being something that tells us how to read everything, right? What are the possibilities for the poem? How can you apply the poem beyond the ways in which you've always seen it applied? What are its uses? When I think about poetry, I think of when I'm writing poems, and I tell my students this, I think about toasters and microwaves and automobiles and tables, because I think poems have real use. And we can't name those uses in the same way. We know what we're going to do with this table, but we understand that poems have uses in our lives. We just don't know exactly how we are using them, but we understand. In the same way, trees have uses in our lives beyond oxygen provider. Do you understand what I mean?
I do, because I think that poems play an important part in my life. We were talking about that in our green room here. So, and I think everyone here probably feels that way too, that poems provoke us, inspire us, connect us to our humanity, and so much more. Let me ask you about the concept of death in the series. Death is played by a character in a carriage. And I found myself particularly drawn to those moments. I can't even say why, but I'm wondering if you could comment on that first, and I'm also wondering if they grabbed you in the same way, these moments with death.
Well, yeah, I mean, death in the show. Well, so obviously the idea
originally came from the fact that Emily's poem, "Because I Could Not Stop for Death, He Kindly Stopped for Me." What an amazing moment. The idea, she takes a carriage ride with death in that poem. And I guess my inner goth teen needed to go on a ride with death in a carriage. And but the death's role in the show, I mean, there's a lot to say about it, but he's kind of, in a way, he's kind of Emily's poetry mentor. Mm-hmm. That's actually mostly what he is. You know, he's the one who gives, he tells her, you are a great poet. You're going to be remembered forever after you die. And she's like, okay, so can I die? And he's like, no. You have to live for a lot longer and write a lot of poems, mm-hmm. you know. But I suppose what is being suggested maybe is that death is the root of all poetry, and that death itself is the poet, or it is what makes life poetic. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, and so then in terms of, you know, actually casting death, that it was so important to me that, like, this, I didn't think this thing was going to work unless death himself really was larger than life and leapt out of the screen in a certain way, more than an actor that you've never seen before and have no cultural associations with. Like, he kind of has to break the fourth wall in some way of the show. And so we were just like beyond lucky to get Wiz Khalifa, who I had put on like a mood board of, this is what I want death to look like. But you know, maybe we could get some other actor to like get Wiz's tattoos or something. And then we're like, oh, we can just get Wiz Khalifa to do it. And I mean, and it's so funny to me because he never had any questions about that. The first conversation we had about it, he was like, yeah, I think I get it. And I think I know exactly what you want me to do. And I was like, okay. And then he did, you know, and it was wonderful. And I mean, we were just so lucky. And then I suppose also just the fact that there was this connection of Haley Steinfeld and Wiz Khalifa both being, you know, musicians and pop stars and having this connection to, you know, music, which in a way is like what poetry was at the time, mm-hmm. you know? Mm-hmm. And that's so they themselves are poets. And yeah, so what's that?
I'm just, I'll say the first episode that I saw where Wiz Khalifa pulls up in that carriage and his death, I was like, okay.
It's hard to say anything else.
It's like, all right, here we go. And of course, because the show does a very interesting and beautiful thing with diversity that would not have existed at the time. I'm always thinking about the intersections and the, you know, where does darkness and blackness intersect, and where do they run away from one another? You know. And with, you know, when I was a kid, the music that everybody was afraid of was like heavy metal, sort of head banging music. And I kept thinking, I wonder if people are afraid of a certain brand of hip hop, you know, like that is the music that is darkness. Do you know what I mean? So I'm always, every time I see him up here, I wonder about that.
Well, and it was extremely important to me that, you know, this wasn't going to be a show where the only person of color represented on screen was a magical figure who was death. And like, you know, and the representation of people of color on the show begins where it begins in season 1 and accumulates complexity as it goes through to season 2 and season 3, which is each season of Dickinson is about race, but season 3 is explicitly about race. And we also wrote it in during the pandemic and Black Lives Matter uprising, and we wrote it over Zoom. It was so intense to be writing this show, in the midst of a moment when the things that the show was saying were coming true, which was that the past was here in the present. People were arguing about Confederate monuments in 2020. It was there. It was. It's like we did not like here is the history. This we are in it. And that there was a James Baldwin quote that I basically had taped over my desk the whole time I was writing Dickinson, which was, "History is not past, it is present." Mm-hmm. And that was the point of the show. That was the whole point of taking this sort of perfect period exterior and then, opening up within it contemporary music and language and looking at a contemporary discourse about gender and sexuality and race and, many issues of what it is to be coming of age as an American today. Actually, if we had a fourth season, I think the whole thing would have been about the environment and climate, and that would have been really apt because Dickinson is so obsessed with the natural world. But
it's not too late for a fourth season.
It kind of is, but yeah, I don't know. We tore the house down, but yeah. A lot of it is at the museum now, and you guys can go visit at the Dickinson Museum. A lot of, yes.
Did you get any flack for that, or was there criticism, and how did you handle it if you did, about the diversity of the cast? Because there are people who I think love the show, but they're also like, why is there an Asian guy at a dance party? Like, why are these Black people dancing?
Well, okay,
it's interesting because there are episodes where the Black man who works, I think his name is Henry, who works for the family. He's like, y'all are a privileged people. Stop trying to involve me in your foolishness, But then there are also episodes where there's just Black people getting down at a party in the living room. Do you know what I mean? How did you? Can you talk about some of those decisions?
Yeah, all of them were decisions, and all of them involved a lot of thought. And it's funny, just to talk about the Asian character for a moment, Toshiaki. He is actually based on a real student who graduated from Amherst College in the 1870s and was a Japanese student who then went back to Kyoto and founded a college there based on Amherst, which is just fascinating. So one thing I would say in general is that I learned more, and as I went about creating the world of the show, including things like background extras, right? Like who's going to be sitting in the lecture hall when they sneak into the college? Who's going to be at the party? What I realized more and more is that my perception of race and history was entirely shaped by movies made in the 80s and 90s, not by the facts of history. And Amherst in the 1850s was actually a very diverse place that people, I think it's just that it's always different than what you think. And I would return again and again to this sort of mantra, which is it wasn't any different. It's the same as now. It's the same as now. But there's been reasons why history has been taught in certain ways. So I can say, there's also an evolution within the show. Like I said, I think in season one, we're doing so much in season one to bring people into the vernacular of this insane show where Emily Dickinson is, going to speak like a contemporary young person. And the only thing I said in season one in terms of the representation of people of color, and I knew Henry and Betty were the two key characters, was that they were not going to be enslaved people, that they had to be characters who, so Betty is a seamstress, and she's meant to be the best seamstress in Amherst, and that was based on this book I found out about that is called Behind the Scenes, that's written by the seamstress of Mary Todd Lincoln, whose name was Elizabeth or Betty, and I based Betty on her. And then Henry really was the Dickinson. The Dickinsons had a groundskeeper who was African American, whose name was Henry Hawkins, I believe. And so both Henry and Betty are skilled craftspeople with entire lives and perspectives of their own. And a lot of that was also based on the work of Aoife Murray, who's involved in the podcast, who wrote this wonderful book called Made as Muse that sort of recontextualizes Dickinson and her voice within all of the non-white people that she interacted with on a daily basis. From, Native Americans who came selling baskets at the kitchen door to her Irish maid Maggie, most importantly, and this is a time when Irish people were not considered white. So it's also about, what is whiteness and like, what is Americanness? Is Emily an American if she can't vote? I mean, she's not enfranchised. So but I would say that, over the course of making the show, I learned a lot and only became more convinced that the more diversity we could put on the screen at any minute, the more accurate it would be to the actual history, not to 80s and 90s movies. that was, my thought.
I want to return to the podcast for a minute. Sometimes it feels like a great big poetry party that I want to be a part of, and I'm sure your listeners do too. So you have other poets like Brianne Dinez and also Ada Limon, I think. Tell me about your decision to bring in other poets. Maybe it was to be in conversation with you, I think. But tell me how you were thinking about that.
Well, we have this idea that the show is three things. The first and foremost thing is gossip. We really want the show to sound like we are talking to our friends, to one another, about a TV show where crazy things happen. And the show is written in a serial way, where you're sort of waiting to see what happens next, waiting to see what is the outcome of this character's story. And we wanted to have a show that was just fun in that way. And then the second thing that we wanted to do is we wanted a show that really gave historical fact, and a show that could sort of help us understand, well, this is where the television is sort of veering off from possibility or veering off from historical fact. And so that's the role that Aoife, who's also a producer of this show, Aoife plays this role as our rogue scholar, because she's a person who has studied for years and years, studied Dickinson's life, and in particular has studied Dickinson's relationship to women who were working class women, laborers in the area. So she knows things that we want to know. She's our scholar on the show. And then the third thing is, as I said earlier, we wanted it to be a poetry show. And we believed that we could still have the gossip and the facts, as well as just beautiful poetry. And so we've had some of our favorite people, some of the country's best poets come, Dinez Smith, Ada Limon, and others too. Evie Shockley's actually, we're gearing up to record an episode with Evie Shockley. So it's been very exciting for us to be able to have this poetry party.
And I feel like, as a listener, you're drawn in. You're just not saying much, if you know what I mean. But we're part of the party. Yeah. Well, speaking about how there are crazy episodes, yesterday was Mountain Day. And as you said, there is an episode where Emily meets Sylvia Plath via time travel. And I have a feeling this audience would be very interested in what motivated you to take on Mountain Day.
Was it Lily? Was it you who told me about Mountain Day? Yeah, there's Lily, who teaches in the English department here, is a friend of mine. And I think it was like a few years ago, we were walking around Smith with our little kids, and I learned that Mountain Day was a thing, and somehow that ended up helping me break the episode. But okay, no, I mean,
Or why Sylvia Plath?
Sorry, yeah. So okay. So the way this episode, I like to call it the world's most underwhelming trip to the future because Emily and her sister Lavinia get in a gazebo, which becomes a time machine, and they travel 100 years to the future to 1955, where they encounter Sylvia Plath, who is an undergrad at Smith at the time, and it is Mountain Day. That's why she's wandering around. They also get to see what the homestead is in 1955, which is not even really yet a museum. It's really just this dusty sort of local curiosity. And Emily gets to learn that she is famous in the future, but they've kind of really messed up her brand because she's famous for being a virgin who died alone of love for a man who was, a spinster, a recluse who was miserable and sad. And, every single kind of myth about Emily that the show is working to fight against, but which I only knew about because of the work of Dickinson scholars like Martha Nell Smith in particular, who is really has been responsible for the recovery and rehabilitation of the relationship between Emily and Sue that was actively erased by Emily's first editors, including Mabel Loomis Todd. Anyway, sorry, there's a lot, talk about gossip. I mean, I said there's a lot of 19th century tea that has not been spilled here, but okay, so Sylvia Plath, she kind of embodies also her own, there's her own myth of, the sort of the impossibility of being a happy female poet, I suppose. And that's a lot of, but the line in the episode that is the most important is when Emily says, we got to get back to the past. Like, the future isn't really what I expected. And Sylvia says, Emily, don't you know the future never comes for women? And that is what the show, that's the statement of that episode is, and in some ways the whole show. And it is, devastating to me to be sitting here on the other side of this show and to have had, the right to choose taken away and women's bodily autonomy taken away in this country. And I mean, so, it fucking sucks. Like, the future never comes for women. Like, and Sylvia and the 50s is as much a desolate place in its way as was the Civil War and as is now. It's tough. I don't know.
Do you have a favorite episode?
Oh, I don't know. That's a great question.
Or a moment in an episode? Like she encounters Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau.
Yeah, no. I mean, to be quite honest with you, my favorite episodes, when you asked that question, the first thing I thought about is an episode where Sue and Emily are sharing the bed and they are making love. And I love that episode so much because Wild Nights gets written because of that. And so I do think, you mentioned this active erasure of that relationship. I think partially just meanness, right? People are horrible and people have all kinds of prejudices. But I know for a fact in the case of Whitman, people, and I imagine in the case of Dickinson, people are really afraid that if you understand that your hero is a human being, that you lose your hero. And the truth is that you do. So what? You lose your hero, but you still have your hero's poems. Sometimes I wonder if that's a little easier for me because I grew up Black in the South. Do you know what I mean? Like, so. We were reciting before we came in here. The president of your college was reciting me a T.S. Eliot poem, which I really appreciate. Almost made me cry. And I was like, girl, we finna go on stage, girl. Like, don't make me cry now.
I was talking about the first poem that really moved me and how I discovered poetry. No.
No? I don't want to get in trouble at Smith. But that, T.S. Eliot had, even Walt Whitman, These people had no sense that I should know how to read and write. They really did not think that was a good idea. That's all I do is read and write. Do you know what I'm saying? But I love T.S. Eliot's poems. I mean, I love them. And I can read them. I think I'm able to balance things enough in my mind where I can make use of those poems in my life and not have him be a hero. And also, if somebody's not your hero anymore just because they were queer, like, see a therapist.
Well,
One thing I seem to have, another thing I learned over the course of making this show is I think everyone in the past was queer. So that's kind of where I'm at. I don't know, like name me one person who wasn't queer.
But they also did not have the word. Like they didn't have these terms we had. They didn't have, things were not outlawed in the way that we think. You mentioned the woman's right to choose. The last episode we recorded, we were talking about a great deal about the fact of abortion and when abortion becomes a problem. And it only becomes a problem when men make it one. Because before that, it's not legislated at all. It's completely an individual woman's business.
We did want to have an episode. We didn't end up doing it, not for political reasons, but it just didn't make it into the final mix. But we had a thought that we would have an episode where Lavinia would get accidentally pregnant and Maggie would help her get an abortion by using, herbs and the way that they handled things in the 1850s. The law of Dickinson, of making the show, was that we always had to find the fact. We called it dark fact. We always had to find the thing that was true but felt uncannily relevant to now. Just as an example, I was at the Dickinson Museum yesterday, and my favorite part of the museum is up in the nursery, the top floor of the evergreens. There's a door, two doors that the kids, Sue and Austin's kids, just like taped pictures from newspapers and magazines and made a collage on the door. And it's exactly what somebody would do today. It's exactly what I did when I was a teenager in my bedroom, and there's just crazy pictures of cats and kids and all kinds of weird things and like advertisements and that collage aesthetic was actually quite big in the 1850s. A lot of women sitting at home bored would just make surrealist collages where ducks had human heads and you see these things and you're like, what is this? Like, is this on the internet today? It's like a cat video. It's so weird. But they were making it then, and it is true. It is fact. It is dark fact, and so they but I think again it's like we don't really like to look at how weird history was in a lot of cases, or how, again, it's still the same.
Well, I want to give the audience a chance to ask a few questions. We have a microphone there. We want to get as many questions as we can. So who would like to start us off? You're going to need the microphone, though, because we have people watching online.
I was wondering if any of you have seen the movie Wild Nights with Emily, and if that was maybe any kind of inspiration. I think it came out in 2018, and it's about her older life, but I feel like it had a lot of similarities to the show. So.
I never have seen it because I've never let myself see it. I was already working on Dickinson, the show, before Wild Nights came out, and I was aware of it, and I was frantically calling my agent and saying, I'm telling you, it's an Emily Dickinson moment. And then there was The Quiet Passion that came out as well. But so I never watched either of them because at that point I wanted to believe and only see my own characters. But I've certainly read a lot about it and am aware of its telling of Emily's life, which absolutely dovetails with mine. And I'm glad that Wild Nights with Emily also exists and is about her older life.
And my students are all mad at me because I haven't seen it yet, but I just got to get through this podcast and I'll watch it, I promise.
So I know you talked about how poetry and music kind of go hand in hand. Could you talk about like the soundtrack of the show and how the decisions for that were made? Because, you know, it's a period piece, but the soundtrack is also my hype playlist in the morning. So they're so different.
Yeah, well, I think, okay, so basically, like, the you know, I suppose you could, in some ways, the gimmick of Dickinson, or the way, but also the most serious thing about it, the way it works is that, you know, every visual feature of the show is period accurate. You know, down to extreme research. Like, we would be told, oh, that pattern didn't exist until the 1870s. Get it out of here. You know, like, it was completely accurate to the time. But that is meant to stand in tension with, or in a kind of like perpendicular contrast with, the music and the language of particularly Emily and her peers and anyone who's pushing up against the constraints of the society. Right? The more that they're in line with the constraints of the society, the more they tend to sound the way we think of as typical classic period. And the more that they're pushing up against it, the less they sound like that, and the more they sound just like us. And so it's almost like, I feel like the show has these two polarities, and one end is the corsets and the other end is the soundtrack. And the music is like bursting out of the corsets. And specifically in terms of how we chose the songs. So there did sort of come to be a feeling that, like, we wanted the most up-to-date music that we could get. Sometimes we would try like a song from the 80s or something, and it just wouldn't work. So we wanted the newest possible music. And then we just have this absolute genius as our music supervisor, whose name is DeVoe Yates, and he had done the music for Eastbound and Down and Vice Principals and Gemstones, and I wanted Emily Dickinson to have the same kind of swagger as Kenny Powers. And so I specifically wanted DeVoe to do our music, and he was just absolutely one of my favorite collaborators that I got to work with on this project, and he would just blow my mind by finding the best songs, and often by artists who are queer or just in some way, like, kind of people who were like Emily in their own rooms recording their stuff and not necessarily getting it heard. That would sometimes happen. And then sometimes Taylor Swift, and so yeah.
Hi, kind of like building on the last question, I wanted to ask a little bit about like the modernity of the show. I'm really a big fan, and I've talked to a lot of other people about it, specifically younger people. I have a cousin who's like 15. Maybe she was like 13 when she started watching the show, and she loved it. And I think that's really unique to Dickinson, because I don't feel like there are a lot of other period comedies or dramas that people that young can relate to. So I just wanted to know, like, what motivated you to want to make the show have this like really interesting modern twist?
Yeah, I that's really exciting to me to hear, because I mean, it's however many decades later, and I'm still thinking about my so-called life. So I'm hoping that the teenagers of today will be so. But I think, again, that is what the show is about. Like that James Baldwin quote that I referred to: "History is not past; it is present." That is what I was trying to say through Dickinson. Was that we as Americans today are contending with and shaped by forces and formats and ideas that came about hundreds of years ago and are still wreaking havoc on our lives today.
For both of you who spend so much time, like work time, focused on and talking about Emily Dickinson, I'm curious if she ever, or her work, or the way she lived her life ever shows up in your personal life when you're not expecting it, or like whether you keep her in mind, if there's anything about her you keep in mind, just like as you go about things.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned earlier, Alena was talking about how Dickinson did her work for decades, not with the expectation that it was going to get her a Grammy. And I think if you become serious about anything, particularly about writing, she's kind of like a patron saint of what it takes to keep asking these questions about what a poem is, what it takes to keep doing what you might think of as getting better or transforming your idea about what you can do in a poem. And I think for me, she's always been all that stuff, all those myths about her have actually been quite inspiring in some way. Learning what I've learned about her more recently and just how social she really was is also very inspiring for me because I'm social. So I want to know that I can be a poet who also has friends, who also falls in love, who also, who makes love, who enjoys music. So I do think my relationship to Dickinson the poet has to do with doing the work that you have to do because it's good for you. Challenging yourself for the sake of a challenge and understanding that that is worthwhile. Do you know what I mean? I mean, if anybody's got a PhD, that's the only reason why. Do you like you believe that thinking and growing thought in a developed and organized way is worthwhile,
I was wondering if you could talk about the similarities and differences between writing for the stage and writing for the screen and what that's been like.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like my work as a playwright is what really prepared me for being a showrunner and creating a TV show. And in many ways, I mean, both literally in terms of the fact that when I made Dickinson, I hired a bunch of people that I had worked with in the theater or even gone all the way back and, been at grad school with, et cetera, et cetera. But also it felt like putting on a play, but just like on a much bigger scale. Right. But I was already used to I knew what it was like to be a writer who wrote for performance and a writer who had a vision that I needed to be able to sort of marshal the troops in order to execute in reality. And I think also being a playwright, you think in terms of budgets, you think in terms of, getting a lot done with a limited amount, or being able to like work within constraints, which is also a very Emily Dickinson mode. So I think that being a playwright, is what taught me how to be a showrunner. And then there was an additional learning curve where I really the transition only was about learning what cameras do. Which was hard for me because I have really poor spatial awareness. But I'm married to a cinematographer, so I get like some home study lessons. He's like, "This is eye line." I'm like, "What? I don't." Anyway, it's good, but I think I've got it now a little bit. I mean, television evolved from the theater. So if you go back, like the roots are still there. You've got people in a room talking, doing scenes. That's what a lot of Dickinson is. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, maybe?
So earlier you were talking about the notion that our external lives are different than our internal lives, and I think that's really interesting, especially in a historical context, like which do we leave behind? And I think it also sort of speaks to the having heroes and then learning about them and having them not be heroes anymore, but still appreciating their work. I just found that really interesting, and I would ask that you just talk about it a little bit more.
Oh, wow. I don't know, but the first, maybe I don't know what else I can say about that second part, but this first thing that you said really struck me, the idea about what we leave behind. It's really interesting because it makes me wonder, if we are indeed doing what we love, then I guess what we leave behind is only that. The external stuff, I'm not sure how the external stuff, other than like, you know, you have kids and they look like you, and then they have kids and they look like you. I don't know how the external stuff would get left behind anyway. I can't think of it right now. But if if you're an architect and you come up with a design that becomes the design, then you end up leaving behind that which was internal, right? And if you're a poet and you leave your poems behind, you end up leaving behind that which was internal. But the weird trick about that is that cannot be your intention when you are coming up with the design or making the poem. If I'm thinking about immortality trying to write a poem, I'm never going to finish a poem, because no poem in my mind that I'm consciously thinking of that way that I'm trying to compose, no poem's ever going to be good enough for that. I'm sure William Carlos Williams was not thinking about immortality when he wrote This Is Just to Say. But we got to deal with those plums. We've been dealing, middle school, high school, college, these damn plums. Do you know what I mean? And I think had he thought about that, we wouldn't have the plums. But because he believed, like, I'm having a good time here, I'm just going to do this little thing about plums.
Well, and it also makes me think about how close we all came to not having Emily's poems at all, because it's many accidents that led to us having them. I mean, when she died, her poems were hidden. She had given Lavinia instructions to burn them, but I've read a very interesting take on that, which is that was sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's like, burn them, like, because it was like required that women be modest about what they had written. And so it would have been required for her to say burn them, but she would have known Vinny would have never burned them. So I don't know, but they could have easily been lost. They could have easily been burned. They weren't. And I mean, and there's a whole interesting story about, because Sue had hundreds of Emily's poems that she had sent to her. And Sue really dragged her feet about getting them out there, probably because she was in such grief at having lost Emily. And so I guess it's also to say that, like, love is what matters, and we create each other as well, and you can't make an act of art without giving it to someone, and it matters what they do with it as well. And I don't know, being in relationship. And Emily is the patron saint of loneliness in so many ways. And she's the patron saint of like just shutting herself away in her room. But ultimately it was her relationships that saved her work and that gave it to us.
Thank you. If you've listened to Jericho's podcast, then you know that at the end of the first episode, he reads one of his own poems. So I thought we might end this Smith Poetry Party with a reading.
I'm going to read a book from a poem. A poem from a book that... I'm going to read a book from a poem. I'm going to read a poem from a book that's on sale outside the door.
That's a beautiful cover.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I should know what I'm going to read. I'll read for it in the morning. Actually, I'll read a duplex. There's a form I invented called the duplex. It's a hustle, a sonnet, and a blues poem all at once. Duplex. I begin with love, hoping to end there. I don't want to leave a messy corpse. I don't want to leave a messy corpse full of medicines that turn in the sun. Some of my medicines turn in the sun. Some of us don't need hell to be good. Those who need most need hell to be good. What are the symptoms of your sickness? Here is one symptom of my sickness. Men who love me are men who miss me. Men who leave me are men who miss me. In the dream where I am an island. In the dream where I am an island, I grow green with hope. I'd like to end there. Thank y'all so much.